This is a brief review recording for the exam coming up on, we're going to do on Blackboard. Since on Blackboard, I don't feel the need to go crazy about reviewing because it's effectively all Blackboard exams are open book exams by definition. So here we go. This is about the immune system. There's the levels of the immune system, the innate system, which involves the first level are skin and lining tissue, mucosal lining tissue. That's the innate system. So whether it's the skin, whether it's secretions, whether it's the salty content, whether it's the acidity on top of the skin, all of those, whether it's the bacteria that are overlying, all of these are part of the innate defenses. The same is true for even the moist barriers, which have mucus and saliva and things like that play a significant role. They're all part of the innate defenses. And then underlying that, you have the cellular arm of those defenses and the chemical arm, but particularly the cellular arm with things like classically we call them dendritic cells, but there are little cells that sample. We find them all sorts of places like that. They sample the environment and they react to it. You have patrolling macrophages, you have lymphocytes, you have neutrophils. All of those are in the soft tissue that underlying all lining cells is loose areolar connective tissue. So it's all there. That's part of it. And understand this is a little bit of this dovetails into the relationship with the blood system. We did mast cells come from basophils. They're filled with histamine granules and other things. Macrophages come from monocytes. Viruses are attacked by lymphocytes. Bacteria are attacked by neutrophils. Eosinophils deal with other kinds of parasites. They play a role in allergies, just like the basophil slash mast cells do, etc. So there's a lot of building on those two things. And so we understand the way that all of those elements work. Okay, by and large, with the exception of viruses and lymphocytes, the way the immune system attacks it, immobilizes, it breaks down, uh, it detoxifies, it neutralizes, it agglutinates, it does all of those types of things, and then macrophages come along and gobble up everything. The only ones that are direct destroyers are lymphocytes. Remember, they have all those, perforins and granzymes, those powerful, they sort of the lymphocyte bonds to the bad cell, whatever it is. Remember, that's the cellular immunity arm, and releases, you know, basically these penetrating proteins that create little holes, and then they blow in all sorts of enzyme chemicals to destroy it from within, etc. So, I mean, I think those are just understanding the basics of it. And again, the distinction in the immune system is when we have cells that have been cells that have been invaded and changed by bacteria, by viruses, or they become a cancerous cell, or they're a foreign cell, a transplanted or a transfused cell. That's the cellular arm. When you're looking at basically whether a bacteria or a virus has basically just, if it's colonized a cell or used a cell and the cell has exploded, then effectively those organisms are effectively being released into the environment. They're free floating. They haven't per se changed the cell. They may have destroyed it, but they haven't changed the cell and maybe created it into a little factory. That's a little bit different that's there. So it's a question of how they've altered the cell if they're inside of the cell. Otherwise, if they're just setting up shop, colonizing the exterior of the cell, then all of that becomes what we call the humoral arm. That's short for antibodies. So, and to be fair, most of the way our immune system works, and the most frequent things that we employ are antibodies. And the antibodies again have like basically four different roles. Pardon me, how they work. I'm trying to be quiet since early in the morning. Pardon me again. Uh, they neutralize, they precipitate, they agglutinate, and they activate complement, which assists in all of those things. That are such an important part about it. And understand, and then once that again, that innate arm, the end product of the innate arm is typically inflammation, and it does so by again those cells releasing chemicals we call cytokines, and basically creating a process of increased fluid in the area. And so the fluid brings white blood cells in. The fluid itself dilutes toxins and byproducts that could lead to the infections. there's clotting factors that come in because walling it off is important. Remember, the first immunoglobulin on the scene, if it gets to the if it other if it get bigger part, first immunoglobulin on the scene, if it gets to the more adaptive arm, the advanced arm, is first immunoglobulin M, and then it's followed by immunoglobulin G. So IgM is first on the scene, and IgG is later in the scene. So there's just little things. And typically, in that innate system, that's where the immunoglobulins that are present are IgA, because they're always there. They're in the secretions, they're there in the mucus, they're there in the saliva, they're there along any of those boundaries as part of that secondary arm. Okay. And the IgE is something that's more related to allergies. You should remember that. That's typically attached to mast cells, and when an allergy or a reaction of that nature triggers it, that IgE basically causes that mast cell, former basophil, to release histamine and other chemicals to facilitate swelling and inflammation and inflammatory response. A lot of those cytokines work on capillaries. They open up the little clefts, white blood cells. Remember, they're able to come close to the margins of the capillaries. We call that margination. Little clefts open wider so they can sort of squeeze their way out. That's called diapedesis. And cytokines means moving cells, and they're moved or attracted to the area where the invader is, and that's really the start of those cardinal signs of inflammation. Remember, heat, swelling, redness, pain. And we always learned it in the Latin with rubor, red, calor, heat. Tumor means swelling in that Latin context, and dolor, which means pain. Most people are aware of that. The other chemicals that are always available, some are more specialized by the adaptive system. Interferon is one of those. Interferons in the innate system basically tell cells in the area, oh, there's a virus in town, and it hit one of us. Lock your windows and lock your doors. In other words, it hardens the boundaries. There are other kinds of interferons, and they have letters after them, but I don't go crazy about that, that are produced by the adaptive system, that are in that family of interleukins, all those very interesting chemicals that are released with the assistance of helper T cells and from other members of the T cell line that are there. And they play such a role in the adaptive system because they're very specific. For instance, those would be dealing with certain specific kinds of viruses rather than a general viral invasion, like a cold. Basically, why it doesn't go wild, colds are somewhat localized more than anything else. And it's your immune system that gives you more of the systemic response, because interferons work at least to stop it from going bananas. Again, we have fever is appropriate. Fever is released by some chemicals called pyrogens. I mean, sometimes it'll be, again, if it goes into the adaptive system, now we're dealing with a whole different arm of interleukins that play a role, and sometimes they can be damaging. But in general, fever of these pyrogens is a response because all of our enzymatic activities, our immune system, our production of antibodies, it ramps them up. Because temperature means things work faster up to a certain point, so it's there it's there almost in a protective role to accelerate our defenses, so they can get a handle on this thing before it overwhelms the defense. Remember, in an innate system, we're trying to stop this before it becomes too much. Once it gets to the adaptive system, it's a significant problem. Now you have to mount a very, very specific response. So the adaptive has the beauty of immunological memory. It can work locally in the area. It'll go all over the body, so it's not limited. Okay, typically lymph nodes play a role, and inevitably, whether it's a helper T cell or a cytotoxic / killer T cell, T cells play a significant role in all of these things, and that's all useful for you to remember that are there. Allergies. Really, typically, allergens are too tiny for the immune system, so they have to bond to some type of protein, and so we call them a hapten. that's short for half an antigen, but colloquially it was something like that. I mean, so it was typically named as a hapten or half antigen. The term hapten, HAPTEN, struck. They've got to bind to some kind of proteins to be effective. Okay. And again, when we talk about in general about antigens, we again historically it was antibody generating. Now we have self and non-self. And so where do we see them? We see them on major histocompatibility complexes, those HLAs, those specific cellular locations. Just you don't just there's no HLA, not what the acronym means. And what more often than not, they are short chains of carbohydrates on proteins. That's really what signals our immune system is where we're self or non-self. So it's a little bit different. Things have changed. And again, when you get in this adaptive system, when you're talking about T cells is not it's not something. B cells are produced rather rapidly, comparatively speaking. It's a less complex. If you remember all those animations and things like that in the description, I'm not going to be questioning you about a lot of that. But in general, if you might remember from lecture, T cells, they mature in the thymus and become effectively what we call, they become able to fight. A degree of competency or maturation is achieved in the thymus. The trouble is most of them don't make it. Only about 2% of those cells successfully make the transition from there into being active T cells, whether they're helper T cells or killer T cells, toxic T cells. Again, those antigen presenting cells, and that's what the term I was trying to think before, dendritic cells, Kupffer cells. These are cells with long arms that are constantly sampling the environment, and they play a pivotal role in in all aspects of the immune system, particularly in the humoral or antibody production. So there's so many arms and pieces to this thing. And again, when we're making antibodies, we either have memory cells, and again, in the adaptive arm, you have effector cells and memory cells for the most part. The effector cell in the humoral arm that makes the antibodies is a plasma cell, and then you have memory B cells. In the cellular arm, you have the effectors, the ones that do that fight, are the cytotoxic, what we used to call killer T cells. Certainly there are memory T cells, but because it's remember, antibodies have a lifespan. It's only when we're dealing with a tumorous situation where we have an overproduction of antibodies. Those plasma cells have a lifespan. They stop after a certain period of time, and the antibodies eventually go away. Those proteins will denature over time. They don't become a problem to you. We have to have some kind of, now we call them regulatory T cells. The old days we used to call them suppressor T cells, because they were the opposite of helper T cells. Helper T cells engage the system. These regulatory T cells, they basically tell that cellular arm of your immune system, okay, enough, we won. Quit making all those chemicals and all that stuff, because now we're creating a problem. And understand, when we talk about autoimmune disorders, that's where it comes from. The inability to shut down the system in many, many cases. Forming antibodies that attack healthy cells rather than attacking invaders. Cytotoxic T cells attacking healthy cells rather than attacking invaders. Overproduction, very, very commonly, of a lot of these chemicals that are what we call pro-inflammatory agents. I mean, inflammation is good, but when it gets out of hand, then it's very hard. It's kind of, I'm doing this Tuesday morning. It's why I left a little early. Didn't stay for my late lab on Monday because my arthritis was flared pretty darn good. That's the way it works. And so understand, the idea of the memory cell plays a role in immunization or vaccines, and what we do is with bacteria, typically they work through toxins, and so what we do is we basically modify the toxin. Basically, we call it toxoid. We take the toxin, we heat it up. Inevitably, they're almost always proteins. Remember, gram-negative toxins, the endotoxin is not. That's typically fatty. That's one of the problems with that. But the typical exotoxins are proteins. You heat them, they denature. We heat them in such a way that we deactivate them, and they become something we call toxoid. So they provoke the immune response without hurting you. On the other hand, for viruses, we have to deactivate them, and the fancy name for this is called attenuation. Attenuation. When we attenuate, we alter it in some way, shape, or form. Do we treat it chemically or physically? However it is done. But we're preserving their antigenicity without allowing them to cause you harm. The difficulty with vaccines is preservatives, okay, on both sides. And so a lot of these vaccines, where most of the preservatives are relatively harsh chemicals you learned about. You probably learned about in micro tests, things like that, using aldehydes, using thimerosal, mercuric compounds. I mean, look, their very nature, because they're basically disinfecting agents. They're pretty toxic when you enact them, particularly for little kids. And that's something that you have to understand as well. And then how we get our immunity from your mom, you get a kind of passive immunity. You get antibodies. They guard you for about 6 months till your immune system can start to ramp up. Okay, we call that naturally acquired passive immunity. Sometimes we'll give somebody a dose of antitoxin. Let's say if they were bitten by a snake, and that will, or they weren't tetanus current. You're worried about a tetanus infection. You're giving them antitoxin. That's passive. Passive means you're not stimulating their immune system, you're just guarding, and that's artificially acquired. On the other hand, when you get an immunization, be it for a viral or a bacterial infection, okay, that's artificially acquired, okay, not passive, but active immunity, because you're stimulating memory cells. And then if you actually get the disease, and I tell her, like I did as a kid, you get chicken pox and measles, you don't have to have any immunizations for that, you got the disease. And most of the time, if you have the disease, the immunity for many of these is lifelong. Sometimes you need boosters depending on the disease. Remember the two light and two heavy chain structures of the and what they look like. One's longer, one's shorter. The longer is a heavy chain. They're pairs, they're identical. They have a constant end where they're attached, like the stem of the Y or the T. And the arms have the variability at the tips of the arms, and that's where they latch on to things. So that's the structure for antibodies. You know the roles of all of them. Like I said, IgM first on the scene, IgG by far and away the most produced, IgE for allergies, IgD, don't know a whole lot about, plays a role in B cells, IgA in your secretions, IgM is a pentamer, IgA is a dimer. Those are all things. Okay. And remember all the activities, I went over that before. The distance between helper T and cytotoxic T cells, they are different because of the markers that activate them and when they're produced. The name for the helper T cell before it becomes activated is called CD4. That's the marker on the cell surface. And the cytotoxic T cells is CD8. So when they're actually immature and naive, what we call that, they're CD4 and CD8. Once they're activated, then they become helper T cells and killer T cells, respectively. And again, remember all those things I talked about: interleukins, antigen-presenting cells, opsonization, helper T cells, cytotoxic T cells, memory cells. They're all parts of that adaptive immune system. They're really important. And again, the distinction, I can't emphasize it enough. The importance of a lot of the questions are: is it the adaptive arm? Is it the innate arm? Is this the cellular based one? Is this the humoral based, which means antibodies? All of those types of things that create allergic reactions. Remember, the most common ones for the life-threatening anaphylactic shocks, bee stings, and nut oils by far and away. When you take something orally, I'm not saying, they consider them like nut oils, they can lead to anaphylactic shock, but generally oral means time. And you have a little wiggle room for time, so it doesn't usually lead to. It can lead to some pretty severe allergic reactions. I can't tell you how many times I've seen people break out in hives, from unexpectedly from like a dose of amoxicillin, kind of stuff. Because remember, you have to have a sensitizing dose. So all of that's part of it. Part of my voice this morning. Helper T cells help everything. Okay, all lines. Remember when we do the tuberculosis test, it's a delayed reaction things. Remember where they mature, B cells in the bone, or they're all born in the bone marrow. B cells mature in the bone marrow, T cells mature in the thymus. I think that's important. Again, in the innate arm, we have lymphocytes floating around. Most of them are called NK or natural killer cells. Again, you have neutrophils fulfilling the role in the innate system of dealing with getting bacteria and viruses before they get started. And ones that have already started to infect cells, or cells that are beginning to change as they multiply, and you get a cell that looks aberrant or a precancerous cell, that's when these NK cells do their thing. They're part of the innate system. They haven't gone to the adaptive system. They're there. And review all the different things that can occur that are considered hypersensitivity, whether it's just an allergy, whether it's anaphylactic shock, whether it's transfusion reaction, whether it's an autoimmune disease, any of those kinds of things are all classically referred to them as hypersensitivity reactions. That's important. Okay. Let's see what else is coming along here with this. Oh, and on the respiratory front, again, most of the resistance, I mean, you understand, as the bronchi are wide, but as they begin to narrow, they provide a little more resistance. Remember, resistance is not just looking at the isolated diameter of one structure, but it's the accumulated diameters because they keep branching. So as they first start to narrow, the resistance increases. As you begin to see, but they continue to branch, you get more and more branches, you add up the diameters, and resistance dissipates. It's a little bit different. In blood vessels, as they get smaller, then the resistance increases, even though there's diameter. That's why the arterioles control blood pressure. Here, effectively, when bronchitis occurs, it's those medium-sized bronchi that can really cause some difficulty. And again, you need to remember things like how should I say it? You have to remember things, the difference between the upper and lower, basically the dividing line to me is the larynx. I don't know if I have a question about that. But when we're talking about I made a big emphasis about the conducting system, moving air in and out that ends at the terminal bronchioles. That's when all of those, when effectively the cartilage disappear. Maybe there's a scant plate or two. But when you get to the respiratory zone, it starts with the respiratory bronchioles. We know them because effectively the cartilage is gone. And what we're seeing is the opening into alveoli. So at that point, you're close enough in probably nanometer terms, in very tiny microscopic terms, for oxygen and carbon dioxide to exchange by way of simple diffusion. We don't have to rely on moving the air in or out. The conductive system, moving air in or out. The exchange or respiratory division based on diffusion. So those are the two. That's an important understanding what that is, those particular areas that are part of it. Again, the whole idea of when we look at part of the unit with regard to blood pressure. Let me tell you. Oh, I apologize. I have to take out that. I'll take out that question on respiratory. I must have left it in by mistake in my PowerPoint. I'll see if I have any more, but we'll get it cleaned up. Save that respiratory information for the final. That's when it'll be coming. I apologize. My other class is doing it. My advanced class is going to have respiratory on this test, even though your materials are similar. So moving on. Okay, when you're talking about blood pressure, remember the systolic is the ejection pressure. That's how much force it generates when it finally opens when those semilunar valves exiting the aorta, particularly, is the high pressure outlet. That's the big number. That's the systolic. The diastolic is the resting tension. That's when your heart's not pumping. How much pressure there is at a minimum in those vessels. We call that the diastolic. That is a great generalized measure of peripheral resistance. So you have to be wary. You have to really understand that. Okay? That's such an important measure. What doctors and nurses look at, that bottom number is the big play. Top numbers vary. okay, depending on circumstances. But bottom numbers remain relatively constant, and they change and they change. Unfortunately, they change slowly, but when they really start to change, it's harder to bring them back to normal. That's when your pressure goes up. It's an effort to get it come back down where it's supposed to be, long-term treatment wise. The regulatory areas are called the carotid and aortic sinuses. Effectively, they're pressure sensors. We're dealing with blood pressure. And what they do is they alter heart rate and force of contraction. So they measure it at the bifurcation of the carotid arteries, and they measure it really in the aortic arch. Those, because that's where it's coming. A lot of it has to do with adjusting it so one, you have adequate blood flow to the brain, and two, you get adequate blood flow to the rest of the body. Remember, when it comes to blood, there's more of it in the veins than anywhere else. That's really important. Okay, we again, we give short shift to veins, but at any time, almost 2/3 of the blood is lying in veins. You have a relatively small amount of the arteries. It's all distributed. Veins don't have the advantage of arteries, so venous return is important. There's a lot of adaptations in veins. You have valves; they have to rely on muscular activity. It, Blood slows down. That's where we're in danger of getting clots, much more so in veins than in arteries. That's not to discount arteries, but it's funny, a lot of the clots in some of the arteries, okay, are not nearly as problematic as veins. Not nearly as frequent would be a better word. I would measure the role. And understand what member MAP, MAP, mean arterial pressure, how to calculate it, review that. The role of angiotensin converting enzyme, remember that really important pathway producing the kidney, the renin, that renin, we call the renin angiotensin aldosterone mechanism. To control blood pressure, kidney has little sensors. They secrete renin, okay, in the filtering apparatus of the kidney based on chemical and pressure changes. The renin activates a chemical that's in the bloodstream called angiotensinogen. It's a precursor. Ogen means it's inactive. It becomes angiotensin 1. Then eventually it goes to the lung. And in the lungs, there's an enzyme called angiotensin converting enzyme, and it makes it into angiotensin 2, and that triggers aldosterone. Okay, angiotensin 2 is the active part of it, and it does 4 different things. Okay, angiotensin, angio is blood vessels, tensin is increased tension. It raises blood pressure by making them tighter, actually increasing the resting tension. This is there for low blood pressure. It makes you thirsty, so you bring in more fluid. It makes you retain more fluid in your kidneys. That's antidiuretic hormone, which we talked about before. And it causes the release of aldosterone. And aldosterone basically induces more sodium to be retained in the bloodstream from the urine, and water follows it. 4 actions that are there. Okay. And so understand all of those things, thirsty, activating aldosterone, all of those capabilities. Okay. Antidiuretic hormone, tightening up blood vessels, that's all important. Remember the different kinds of arteries that are there. Okay. The role of the elastic or conductive arteries, particularly with regard to maintaining blood flow. Remember that whole idea of the dicrotic notch and what it actually means. I know we talked about it heart, but basically what it does, it means non-turbulent blood flow. It makes that 120/80 really make it much more gently than irregular. It's not like big powerful waves smashing into the shore. It's more like gentle waves coming in when the ocean's relatively calm. So, and the big area we control them is in the arterioles. That's that difference between the respiratory nugget that's there. The arterioles are that area where the smooth muscle can open and close and redirect blood flow. And I think that's so important. So I think you have to be on top of that. And I think everything else is good from there. If I think of anything else that's part of it, I will let you know. There may be, I think, if I have to do a mini supplement, I will let you know. But this is going to have to do for now. I have to make some alterations in this particular test that I'm looking at to, and I'll probably be talking about the role of distributing arteries And so you understand what they are, and maybe some of the structure of some of the different kinds of blood vessels. Look at the different kinds of capillaries, continuous. Look at blood vessels that are, beg your pardon, so continuous blood vessels, continuous capillaries, the blood-brain barrier, effectively what makes that, because we've discussed that before. I would look at the arteries that are more designed for filtration. And so you can look at the fenestrated, I beg you, not the arteries, the capillaries that are fenestrated. The capillaries are sinusoidal. Where do they occur? What do they do? I think that's in part of it, the distinction, which layer of the anatomically, which layers of the blood vessels are thicker, which are thinner. And to me, if there's anything that I have not covered, I will send you a brief 5-minute talk about them, because I'm going to change a few questions. I can see that now. Thank you very much. Good talking to you. Goodbye.